Coming from the same minds that brought us the likes of Odin Sphere and Muramasa, Grand Knight's History is a turn-based RPG that sees the player having up to 4 characters to utilize, which can be one of 3 different warrior types. You've got Knight, Mage or Archer. You don't take on the part of a playable character though, instead you're put into the shoes of a nameless Great Knight, who chooses to align himself with one of 3 countries, Union, Avalon or Lagres. As you would expect, strategy plays a huge role in each encounter, with the player only receiving a set amount of AP points which must be shared across your party. Each move or action on the field requires a certain amount of this AP to perform, so deciding on which moves each character should make takes more time than you would think. It's fortunate, in true JRPG fashion, the enemies patiently wait for you to plan their demise. What makes the system slightly more interesting is that not only do you receive experience points from a defeated enemy, but also a small amount of AP. This allows you to chain your attacks together and help keeps up the flow and pressure of battle. This tactic is essential and more than comes in handy throughout the game's runtime, but the whole point of the single player with its quests and all of the warriors you can create is to essentially just level up those warriors and deck them out with awesome skills and weapons. At the time of its release, there was an online component that allowed you to take your armies and challenge players all over the world. This feature single-handedly made the game even better, but unfortunately it can't be enjoyed today. Of course, with it coming from Vanillaware, Grand Knight's History is gorgeous. The beautiful hand-drawn sprites and backgrounds really add to the overall quality of the game. If you're a fan of their previous efforts, this one is for sure worth picking up. Undead Knights is essentially a hack-and-slash beat-em-up that shares much in common with the likes of God of War and Devil May Cry, but manages to carve its own path by introducing some pretty neat mechanics that help it stand out. It all revolves around a group of knights who have been granted a second chance at life, but it does come at a cost. You're basically a necromancer who's tasked with turning your enemies into undead soldiers, and damn does it come in handy, as the sheer amount of targets you're in play can make the combat quite intense. To tackle this, you've got a selection of weapons as well as a few special moves that can hack away at the enemy ranks as you progress. But the necromancy takes center stage and allows the player to not only mutate enemies, but actually make them follow instructions as well. From completely decimating someone to bashing down gates or obstacles, there's a surprising amount of things you can do with them, and when you take all of these aspects and put them together, it results in some rather compelling gameplay. The adventure is comprised of about 20 chapters, which will last around 10 to 20 minutes each, so depending on your playstyle, you can expect the game to last you a good 4 to 8 hours. And at first this might sound quite short, but thankfully you can play through the game as any of the other characters, which gives you access to further weapons and skills that help flesh out the gameplay even further. Now, for a PSP game, Undead Knights takes full advantage of the system and manages to pull off a large amount of units on the screen at any time, as well as some pretty detailed environments on top of it. It can get a tad framey once the action really heats up, but luckily it doesn't really impact the gameplay too much. The main hook of the game just never gets old, and will no doubt make people think twice about dismissing it as just a mere clone. If you can find a copy, don't hesitate to pick it up. The PSP played host to several games in the Metal Gear franchise, from the critically acclaimed Peace Walker to the more obscure offerings like the digital graphic novel. Fans of the series had plenty of options, including a rather odd turn-based card game known as Acid. Now, the sequel sees you taking up the fight as Solid Snake, with the story being delivered through in-game cutscenes, as well as comic book-like stills with text boxes. It's not exactly thrilling, and you'll soon find yourself a lot more interested in building a powerful deck of cards and making strategies than the actual story itself. Still, the story is there, and it has its twists and turns, but it does feel like a bit of an afterthought. Like other Metal Gear games, your goal is to sneak through levels without alerting enemies. You can hide in many places, hang off balcony edges, and use weapons and items to get around various obstacles like infrared beams and security cameras. Even the old cardboard boxes here. But the key difference with the Metal Gear Acid series, however, is that most of your moves are carried out by using cards. These cards are collected by picking them up. You can also purchase cards between stages by spending points, which are earned by doing well in a stage. Here you'll find many classic weapons and items from the Metal Gear series. Even characters have made the jump, such as various bosses like the Fury and Psycho Mantis, that have helpful effects once played in the field. Now, when it comes to the visual presentation of Acid 2, it can be quite divisive, as when compared to the rather realistic take in the original, a sort of cel-shaded aesthetic is used for the sequel instead. Personally, I find them quite quite impressive. Everything is bright and easy to see, and a huge improvement over the dark environments of the first asset. And to top it off, the frame rate manages to keep up with the action quite well, resulting in an overall pleasant experience on the eyes. If you're a fan of the series or are simply looking to jump into some pretty challenging card battles, Metal Gear Acid 2 is for sure worth picking up. Hakuwaki takes place during the climactic end of the Shogun rule. Japan teeters on the brink of chaos as political and supernatural powers intervene to bring order back to society. As one of 5 Japanese warriors who each possess the same basic attacks but unique combos and special abilities, the player must battle against overwhelming odds to rid Japan of its foes and restore the peace. Now, Hakuwaki is a third-person hack and slasher that plays like most games from the genre, most notably the Dynasty Warriors series. Despite reusing the same mechanics of other titles, Hakuwaki offsets this by including a comprehensive leveling system and 2 different story modes that help prolong the life of the game. For those who have played any of the Dynasty Warrior games, you'll instantly be familiar with the gameplay. The player must battle countless enemies, complete level objectives, and defeat a boss to move on to the next stage. The mission objectives include basic assignments such as taking out a certain number of soldiers or assassinating an imperial captain. You've got a string of combos to help even the odds, as well as a power gauge that slowly fills up as you battle your enemies, and once it's full, you can execute a special attack by pressing circle. These attacks vary per character, but the end result is a barrage of flashy sword swings that quickly devastate everything in your path. And of course, power-ups are an essential component to the gameplay as well. Defeated enemies will drop health replenishers, skill enhancers, and equipment to improve your chances. Utilizing them at the right time can sometimes mean the difference between victory or defeat, so holding onto them is a really good idea. By no means does this game ever reach the heights of others in the genre, but it does present a competent adventure that is bound to satisfy fans of Muso's. Trying to sum up work time fun is a bit of a tall order. This is perhaps one of the most quirkiest and strangest games the PSP ever received. It's easy to see how comparisons to Nintendo's WarioWare madness might be made, but they're really as different as chalk and cheese. While WarioWare is a collection of really short games that get faster and more intense the further you progress, Work Time Fun doesn't do this. Instead, all of its games are based around part-time jobs, which the original Japanese name of the game loosely translates to. Some of the activities are short, some of them take a while, and some simply just have no end to them. These minigames are very simple and have rather obvious goals in mind, but not many actually resembling realistic jobs, ranging from trying to stab a stitching tool between your fingers at increasing speeds to trying to stop a car in front of a cliff and chopping wood while avoiding animals. But it does actually present some real jobs, which make for a somewhat surreal experience. One of them sees you working in a factory line or sorting baby chickens by gender. After you've done your job, you get a check, and you can then spend this money at gumball machines to win little trinkets or extra levels. This progression system, once you get the hang of it, keeps the game pretty addicting. After all, who doesn't want to dump a bunch of money into gacha machines and try to get lucky? In general, it's just a bunch of insane minigames that are pretty entertaining to check out. Unfortunately, a lot of the games can admittedly get quite repetitive, and when you couple that with the simple controls, this game will only appeal to a select number of people, mainly because of just the bizarre nature of it as a whole. Now, this isn't the kind of game you'll spend hours on, but it is one you'll want to keep on your PSP so you can play it 15 minutes at a time on the bus or waiting in line. But it's the bizarre, surreal charm, satirical sense of humour, and the pace at which it doles out new minigames and toys that will keep you playing it for quite some time to come. Crush is quite possibly one of the most intuitive and downright addictive puzzle games you'll ever play. The concept is simple. Each stage is comprised of the lost marbles of our protagonist Danny to find. Once he finds half of the marbles in the stage, he can make his way to the exit, which allows you to then move on. The hook, however, is that the stage can be crushed into 2D in a variety of ways, from either side to side, front to back, or even from top down. Puzzle games aren't well known for their stories, but Crush does attempt to weave a narrative that focuses upon Danny's mental state. The cutscenes are a well-deserved break from the gameplay, with interesting characters and humorous dialogue that helps sell it even further. But it's gameplay where Crush really excels. To keep it interesting and varied, there's a number of obstacles, blocks, and enemies that litter the world and do different things depending if the game is in 2D or 3D. It adds a nice layer of strategy and keeps things from being boring. The end result is an original and fiendishly difficult game that will push your mind to and beyond its limits. And if collecting marbles levels isn't enough. There's also 2 hidden objects in each stage, a puzzle piece and a trophy. The trophy is what really makes up the game's replay value. It unlocks trophy stages, which let you play the real version of that stage, one with a time limit and a specific number of crushes you're allowed to use. So where does the game fail? Well, really as a puzzle game, it doesn't. It's about as entertaining as you can get, but it is still a puzzle game. That means it's not everyone's cup of tea. And if you weren't into the genre before, you're not going to be into it now. Still, I highly recommend this game and urge you to try it out if it at all looks interesting to you. Half-Minute Hero for the PSP is a game that focuses on one thing, and one big thing at that: speed. Sure, there's other aspects to it other than speed, but just about everything you can do in the game is based around it. Now, the game is primarily split up into 3 main modes, which are basically 3 separate games entirely. The first is Hero Mode, a role-playing game where you have 30 seconds to stop an evil overlord from casting a spell of destruction that will wipe out all of existence. This plays out like an accelerated version of the RPGs of old. You wander around a map fighting enemies at random, carrying out tasks for townspeople, eventually building your level until you're strong enough to take on the boss. And if you run low on time, you can pay a fee to reset the game clock to 30 seconds. The price to do this actually goes up the more often you use it, so time management is key to your survival. The next mode is Evil Lord, a real-time strategy game where you play as one of the evil overlords, and you have to summon monsters to defeat your enemies within the time limit. You get 3 different types of units to summon. You got brutes, which deal a lot of damage, nimbles, which are very fast, and shooters, which can attack from afar. Some enemies also share these types, so it's crucial that you know what to use against them in order to complete the level without running out of time. The third game on the list is Princess, a side-scrolling shooter where you control a princess with a rapid-fire crossbow. The objective here is to travel across the stage and blast your way through enemies and other hazards. These separate modes all add up to a serious amount of replay value, and that's not even mentioning the one that you can unlock. Although each of the modes are great to play, it's Hero that steals the show and becomes a true highlight of the game. If you never got round to it back in the day, Half-Minute Hero is still well worth giving a go. Harvest Moon: Hero of Leaf Valley is an enhanced remake of Save the Homeland on the PlayStation 2. It's got more endings, different town layouts, the ability to get married, new characters, more crops, and much more. Along with any other non-spin-off Harvest Moon titles, this game contains no elements of RPGs and the like. In fact, the majority of the gameplay can be summarized into 2 separate parts: relationships and financial management. The relationships contribute to one of the biggest parts of the game, that being marriage. As the player, you've got to constantly give presents to the girl you wish to marry in order to increase the number of hearts they have towards you. As you would expect, this results in some pretty hilarious and wholesome moments throughout the story, and getting hold of some of the more rarer items really pays off in interesting ways. On the other hand, you've got the financial aspect, and this is where the game comes into its own. There's part-time jobs, more than a dozen selection of crops, and the money you can receive for them changes depending on the season. You can upgrade tools, upgrade your house or your barn, go mining, fishing, and even betting, so there's plenty of ways to plan to maximize your profits. For example, simply cooking an egg can instantly double the profits you get from selling them. Now, much like the other entries in the series, the game is separated into days, with each of them taking up to about 15 to 40 minutes to complete, depending on what you do. Overall, it'll generally last about 2 years. At that point, you can either restart due to not being able to save the village, or move on to the 3rd year, where you can get married and live happily ever after. However, that's not all. You also have a choice of restarting with upgrades already in place, so you can go for all of the 16 endings. The sheer amount of content and choices in what you can do will certainly make this game replayable over and over again. When it comes to side-scrolling shooters, the PSP was home to big hitters like R-Type and Gradius, but one that never got a fair shake is Armored Hunter Gunhound DX. As a huge fan of mechs and shooters in general, I've always wanted to give this game a go, and I recently decided to do just that, and damn was I not disappointed. The gameplay is best summed up by the words on the back of the box: eliminate robotic foes with your gunhound across multiple stages of mayhem. There are a few things done well, and a few things done a bit poorly. What they did well was craft a mostly competent side-scrolling shooter with various weapons and an emphasis on replayability. This game is a prime example of trial and error, rewarding you for learning enemy attack patterns and exploiting them, and this type of difficulty is right up my street, as it's always so satisfying being able to make it through a level without taking a single hit, that it gives the incentive to players who might be finding it tough to work that bit harder. Naturally, there's a ton of power-ups and special items that make the ordeal a bit more manageable. Admittedly, the game is rather short and will only last most players around 3 hours, but with a multitude of mechs, unlockables and different difficulty settings, it's quite easy to make it last a bit longer than its average playtime. Now, when you take into consideration the actual age of the PlayStation Portable, of course the visuals aren't going to blow you away, but for its time, and more importantly being on handheld, the special effects and impressive sprites really make up for any shortcomings in this department. But if there's one aspect that needs a special shot, it has to be the soundtrack, which pumps out some serious tunes for you to shred enemies to. For those looking to pick it up for themselves, a new version is actually available on the PC as well, which makes it easier than ever to enjoy this classic today. The PSP was no stranger to quality RPGs. With the likes of Final Fantasy Tactics and Persona 3 for example, any game had a lot to live up to when it came to the competition, and one that valiantly did so but unfortunately didn't quite make as much of an impact as it deserved has to be E7. Like most entries in the series, it stars the famous adventurer Adol the Red, who at this point in his career is a bit older than the previous games but is also well known as a famous adventurer. He sets off with a friend as they travel to the kingdom of Altago, seeking a new adventure. In true RPG fashion, it's not long until everything goes to shit and you find yourself entangled within a plot that involves the fate of the entire kingdom. Even if it may be a bit tropey, the gameplay more than makes up for any shortcomings in the narrative. At its core, E7 is an action RPG with a combat system which is presented in real time. Naturally, you get to perform a wide range of abilities and spells that make dealing with the generous amount of enemies that litter the land all the more easier. Progression is handled extremely well, with the player having plenty of options when it comes to growing their character, and doing so soon becomes essential to tackling the far more challenging bosses, which are most definitely one of the true highlights of the game. You can tell special attention went into each of them, with bosses getting varied and special attacks, and as you progress further into the game, certain boss fights will start becoming multi-phase affairs that push the quality even further. You can also expect several RPG staples such as equipping items, shopping in the towns and running quests for NPCs, but the fast and fluid combat is what really makes the gameplay shine. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for part 2 as that will be coming up soon, so don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified. You can follow me on all of the socials to stay up to date and also join our growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters Rhino, Skilljim, Nano, Steve, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Paul, Quinn, Dio, Alex, Simon and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining the Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links in the description. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll see you in the next one.